All right, let's go ahead and get started. Well, hello and welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining the Ask Greg series. We're back. Hope you all had some good holidays and a chance to relax. My name is Greg Alevris, and I'm with the Horizon Business Development Team, and I'm an Archibus aficionado. I'm here to discuss product capabilities and share experiences with broad functionality of Archibus. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my camera, and we'll come back when I get online here. But for the time being, we'll go ahead and turn that off. And so today we're going to talk about lease administration. So we're delving beyond the space and asset and ops and getting into the broader functionality of Archibus. And we're starting with lease administration. And this is the 8th episode in our series. And, we'll talk about the end and, what happens next. So just to kind of let everybody know what the guidelines are, for those of you who are first-time attendees, we start with everybody on mute to, of course, maintain silence and decorum and eliminate any sort of background noise. So for those who may or may not hear, my cats are banging at the door trying to get into the room here as an example. At the completion of the presentation, we will open up the meeting for questions. And for today, we're going to ask you to submit your questions in writing to the question box, and it's in the control panel. And in the control panel, there's a little question mark or chat box that allows you to submit questions, type them in, we'll read them, and I'll respond to them. So what is the purpose, or how can we, how do these sessions help you? Well, as I said, the thing that we want to do is make sure that you're aware of some of the Archibus capabilities. Many of you may be using one or two applications and want a better understanding of what else the product can do. And even for those applications that you do use, you want to see what you might be missing. We want to be able to share the knowledge and experience that we've had working with the product and some of the customers that we have. We want to, make sure that we gauge with the Archibus user community, and hopefully in the future we'll be inviting some of the users to join us and help with the presentations. And we are creating a library of material and video recordings that everybody can use. Right now, those are being posted to YouTube, and at the end of the session, when the video is ready, you get an email pointing you to the link. And right now, as we said, there is a library of 7 previous episodes that we have, and eventually just help grow the community forum that we have, and dovetail that with some of the user group communities that we have in the Horizon environments basically. So let's talk about today. We'll start off, of course, with the question of the day, and then I've got 3 topics I want to cover. One is, what are some of the essential lease details that you want to manage? 2, I'll go through some of the details that you actually do to create a lease record. And 3, I'll review some of the reports that are available to you, once you have the lease information. And then we'll wrap up and talk about what's next and answer questions. Today, we want to know, how do I abstract the details of a lease that I manage? That's an all-important questions, and to this day, people do it on paper in file cabinets, or they do it in spreadsheets, or they have full-fledged programs that might be standalone or isolated. But the important thing to understand is that, with the, looking at Archibus and how it helps you with leases, of course, in our case, we're trying to identify which of the locations we use are being leased versus owned by the organization. And the reason that we want to know that is because there's a time constraint. Eventually that lease will expire, and either we'll choose to stay or go. This gives us a greater deal of flexibility to deal with changing work environments. And I think a lot of you are probably going through that now as you talk about COVID and back to work plans. One of the things that you can do, of course, is we know that Archibus integrates with CAD drawings. Well, the same applies to leased areas. You can actually measure the lease areas and connect them to Archibus. Of course, the thing that you also have to be cognizant of is that there is in the contract of the lease what is called the negotiated area, and sometimes you'll find those to be different than what you physically measure. And it's good to know what that is in relation to the agreement versus what you actually have to work with when you get to the floor plan, because there's some interesting calculations that go on there that I've never been able to figure out. Best of all, it helps you manage the overall portfolio that you have and make those strategic decisions of where you need to go in the future. For instance, I know a lot of organizations that have had a variety of field and remote offices have opted to, eventually shutter some of the smaller ones and tie people, back to some of the larger ones because they're pretty much working from home anyway. And then when they do have the people come into the office, they do provide some, bookable workspaces that they can take advantage of. Lease management gives you a financial view into the portfolio as well, because there are a lot of costs that you want to keep an eye on. Of course, there's the rent cost, there's the utility cost, there's the tax cost, there's other operational fees that, the lease system can give you a view not only of what you spent in the past, but how things look projecting into the future. And then, when you think about it, it is how you can tie, what you do to the actual tenants of the location. So even if you're leasing space, oftentimes your organization may be responsible for the maintenance and care of the facilities up to a point, where in other cases, the landlord may have certain responsibility for common areas like lobbies and cafeterias and stuff like that. So what are some of the lease details that you can manage? These are just a couple of items. We'll kind of walk through it very quickly to give you a overall view. One of the nice things about Archibus is that it is a lease management system that allows you to play the role of both landlord and or tenant. So in this case, we are a tenant and the tenant wants to know all the leases in their portfolio and keep an eye on them. Or we can be a landlord. So you can actually be both if you think about it, because in essence, you could sublet space to your own organization, or you can sublet space to other groups, like maybe you're not using all of your space, or better yet, you are occupying an entire building and you're subletting, retail space on the first floor, coffee shops, bank locations, cleaners, etc. There are a lot of components of the lease that we have to keep track of, and some that are very important to the ongoing status. One, of course, is the options on the lease. Nowadays, leases are short-term documents that cover anywhere from 3 to 5 years, typically. I remember a day when I was doing facilities where leases were 20, 25, 30 years long. Nowadays, not so much. And so the options tell us certain things about the favorability of renewing a lease and when we need to do it, making sure that we exercise that option at the right time, or otherwise we miss out on that. Or maybe we need to plan for the expansion of additional space and we want an option of when we can exercise that. So it's good to keep track of those options and when to deal with them. The next, of course, and most important realistically, is the rent schedule. Rent is not something that you pay a straight flat fee for every, month of every year of the life of the rent. It's something that changes on a regular basis. The simplest, of course, is on a year-over-year basis, the rent increases. And what you want to be able to do is schedule those rents at the appropriate time for each year and what that rent rate will be. And where appropriate, you can schedule other types of expenses or income for the lease, like taxes, or maybe you can schedule, utility bills, or maybe service fees and contracts that you might have to pay for. All of that is attached to the lease and gives you that financial profile. And then most important is, the clauses of the lease that affect the relationship that you have with the landlord and who's responsible for what in the building. As a person who lives in the northeast of the US, and for many of you who are in Canada, we know very well that snow is a part of our lives for the most part. So for instance, your lease may include a clause about snow removal. Whose responsibility is it? Typically, it's the landlord for the parking lots and sidewalks, but there may be clauses where you have to be responsible. It's important things like that. Who's responsible for maintenance and upkeep of the facility? What happens if the AC doesn't work? Is it your problem or is it the landlord's problem? These are all things that you need to quickly access so that if something does happen, you can easily reference the leases, because the leases themselves can be documents that are 5 pages, 25 pages, 50 pages, or dozens and dozens or scores and scores of pages. It really depends on what kind of lease agreement you sign. So to help a lot of people manage leases is the notion of critical dates. And critical dates are just when you need to take action. In my many years of working in facilities, my favorite story, of course, is the person who was managing a facility that had a lease, and the lease expires tomorrow on Friday, and they're just now dealing with it. Well, the reason that we get these lease administration systems is to help notify us well in advance of when a lease like that is going to expire, so we can make the right decisions as to when we need to act and decide whether we continue the lease or whether we drop the lease, or maybe we consolidate 3 lease locations into one. I can tell you that from experience that I've talked to people who had leases on warehouses that they were having to renew, and they had to make them in a hurried decision and way without understanding what was going on. And the reality is that the warehouse that they were using was underutilized, maybe only at up to 25, 30% capacity. And they had another warehouse that was also at 25 to 30% or 50% capacity. And if they had had that data and were able to assess properly, they could have made the effective decision to drop the lease on a warehouse if they weren't using it and there were no immediate plans to do so. Well, the same applies for options. Options are something that come ahead of actual lease expirations, and those decisions you make is when you decide to extend a lease can be far in advance of when the lease actually expires. You might be in a 5-year lease, but you have to make that decision about expansion, 36, 30, 24 months before the lease actually expires, notifying the landlord of what your plans are. You can't wait until the month before the lease expires to let them know. And in some cases, you may have to negotiate a new agreement or change. One of the things I've always liked about Archibus is the ability to store documents, and this is a great way of keeping a record of all the lease documents that exist around the leases, rather than putting them in file drawers of paper style or on the servers in multiple folders that are not easy to follow. Archibus does a very good job of organizing the documents and attaching them directly to the lease record or some of the underlying data like the options or like the amendments or like the clauses. So there's very specific places where you can find these documents, and they become easily accessible because they're all context sensitive to the information. So with that in mind, we're going to go through just some basic details. I'm not going to take you through all of lease management, but there are some things that are important to keep up. And if you read a lease, and I'll show you some examples, leases are very long, complex documents. And what you have to be able to do is isolate the relevant information and make sure it gets dropped into the right part of the lease abstract that you're doing. And some of those are the basic lease itself, which refers to just the tenant and landlord start and end dates, the rent details for income or expense, the lease options as we mentioned, and those lease clauses. So just to give you an example, these are sections of a lease that I'm going to be referring to. These ones in particular referred to who was the landlord, who's the tenant, what are the start and end dates, where's the property located, what's the security deposit, and what's the duration of the lease. And as you can see, they're not something by looking at them. You actually have to go through and read the document and pick out the right details and put it into the system. So let's go ahead and do that. And what I'm going to do is just run you through a sequence here where we're going to go ahead and load a lease. So first thing we'll do is go to the lease admin feature of Archibus. We'll go ahead and load the lease portfolio console, which is the tool that we use to review the catalog. Now, in order to do that, we're going to take a step back and look at the lease itself. I've highlighted in yellow some of those elements that I just mentioned that refer to details. And as you can see, this document is quite lengthy, and you have to go through the process of reading it, finding the data, and abstracting it. So right off the bat, we're gonna, take a look and see how all the data fits in. Here we can see the relationship to the building, the appropriate lease, whatever leased areas within the building itself, if it's only partial. What are some of the clauses that we track? What are the options that we care about? What are the amendments and changes to the lease that we've documented? What are any documents that we want to take a look at in catalog? Who are some of our main contacts, landlords, tenants, vendors, tax authorities, etc.? And what are the rent schedules and payments that we have to worry about for the lease and the start and end dates for them? So to manage the details, we'll start with the basic lease itself. So this is the lease table that we're dropping into, and we can see that there are very specific fields that when we read the lease, we have to drop that data into the system, like what is the start date and end date. Those come from the lease document, but we have to then transcribe them and record them correctly. We also have to do the same for who the landlord, company, and contact is, and the same goes for the tenant and tenant contact. And then what is our perspective as the person using the system? Are we the tenant or are we the landlord? And there's other things that we can set up for, but this is the beginning of some of that information that I referenced as far as being able to manage the underlying lease details. So what you can see here is right away, we've identified within the first couple pages of the lease some of that key information that we needed to transcribe and actually store in the database as fields so that we can search and sort on key information. The next thing we want to do is we're going to take a look at some of the underlying lease options and rent details. And so we'll bring up another video here. And what I want to do is, as you can see with the lease down below, we're going to start again by looking at the lease. I've highlighted in green two things. What are the options and what are the rents associated with the lease? So again, I scanned through the lease, I found the right information, and now I have to make sure it appears in the right locations in the lease. What Archibus does is we actually set up some different tables. One of those tables is the options table, and this is a child table to leases that records all the different lease options that you're dealing with. So it tells us the kind of option that it is. It's a renewal, it's an expansion, any other details. When can we exercise that lease? When do we have to make sure we notify, and when does that option expire? Are all important dates that we have to know about. More importantly, we also have to, or just as important, is setting up the rent schedules. And so for every type of rent detail, we actually have to set up the payment, because generally speaking, these are what the rent is going to be on a month-to-month, year-over-year basis. So in this case, we're looking at the year of 2015 to 2016. On each month, we're going to be paying a certain amount of rent. And then that next year, when we enter a new rent record, that might go up by a certain value depending on what there is, and then if appropriate, if there's any sort of VAT taxes that you have to pay, etc. So this gives you a flavor of actually going into the belly of the lease and getting different pieces of information that exist within within the process. And so now that we have those two pieces, I want to do one more here just to kind of give you a flavor. This one talks about some of the clauses. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to literally take some of the key elements of the lease and record them so that that makes it a lot easier to refer rather than having to scan the document. And what we're doing here is literally going to a table that tracks all of the clauses and allows us to identify some of those clauses. And so what you can see here, when I drill down into the document, I'm just picking off a couple of them that are highlighted in purple, and they're around the maintenance of areas just to give you a flavor. But as you can see, there's a lot of stuff there. And now I need to go in and say, all right, what is the maintenance detail? Maybe around cleaning or maybe just general maintenance of the facility. And, who's responsible? Is this the responsibility of the landlord? Is it the responsibility of the tenant, or both? And how does it relate to the term of the lease in question? And, where appropriate, is there any supplemental documentation that we can refer to above and beyond what's in the lease agreement itself? So as we scan through, different information and look at these clauses, we record them and attach them to the lease so we have a point of reference to deal with. And if I were looking at maybe doing a renovation, what I'm doing here is looking at the section of the lease. So I'm actually highlighting in the lease document what paragraph or what section I can refer to if I want to take a closer look at the language, because I don't want to abstract it or summarize it. I can just say, go look at the lease document itself. So again, in this case, it might be the full lease that we take a read on. And again, what is the duration of the information in question? So that kind of gives you a flavor of what we do with just inputting some of the information. It's a lot of different pieces of information that we keep track of. And as a person who would be using the software, what the benefit is you can pick and choose which of these pieces of information are most relevant for you to work with. And so what's nice is, if you think about it, if you just want to track leases and options, or leases and rents, or leases and clauses, or leases and documents, you can choose what aspects of the lease that you do. But from my experience, people want to do those things. Now let's take a step back, and how do we use this information? Well, the important thing is to understand, how does this affect the portfolio that we're managing? And how does it relate to where we're doing and conducting our business? And what's nice is we can roll up and summarize these details in a lot of way. So in one single system, we can not only highlight the critical dates, but we can help color code and alert us to when we're in danger of being and missing some of these dates. So there's that typical red, yellow, green kind of concept, which tells us that we now need to flag these dates. And in this case, the expiration dates are coming up soon enough that if we don't pay attention, we may have an automatic renewal, or we may have to terminate the lease. And by terminating, we may have to suddenly move people out and go someplace else. Now, one way around that, of course, is to make sure that you also do the lease options and exercise those well in advance. As I had mentioned before, there is a lot of financial details that go with the leases. And what's nice here is that you're able to kind of roll up and summarize the leases. So you can see here, beginning in 2021 through 2030, we can look at what the cash flow or what commitments we've outlined. So based on the term of the lease, based on the agreements that we've signed, we can say this is how much money we can expect to spend based on the current rents that we have and the current details that we have planned to spend. And what's nice is, if we need to take a deep dive into the lease, we can literally drill down into and review all the different costs, their start and end dates, and the amounts that affect the lease in question. One of the nice things about tracking and managing leases, there are some things that you might want to know just from a lease and location selection point of view that are very important. So when picking a location, as you can imagine, You might have employees that require daycare services. Is their daycare facility available? You want to know if there's a place, sufficient food capacity. What kind of parking situation? When I worked at Archibus, downtown Boston, parking was not free. Parking was expensive. And depending on my tolerance for pain, I could park very near the office for $35, $40 a day, or I could park, within a mile or two and maybe spend $10 to $15, depending on how much walking I really enjoy doing. Not much, as you may imagine. Or I can decide what's the proximity to mass transit. Are there bus lines, subway lines, ferries that I can take advantage of? These are all amenities that are very useful, helping going through the selection process of building a lease by understanding what are the niceties of being in that lease that will very helpful to attract employees and work in the area. And then from the point of view of just managing the relationship between the tenant and the landlord, between various agents and authorities that you have to deal with, there is a way of tracking all of the communications to help make those kinds of determinations in the future. So if you're constantly sending, I'll be very generous and say love letters to your landlord, complaining about the fact that they're not answering your calls or your emails, those kinds of things you can record in the system so that when it does come time to renew, you can review the history with the landlord and determine where they, satisfying their customer service and making you a happy tenant. And if the case is no, and same goes for a landlord, if you have a tenant that is, destructive or unruly, you can record that and decide to not renew. So communications are very effective and key part of the lease. So to wrap all of the stuff up for today's session, we look at Archibus as a single source for all of these different lease details, whether it's just the basic lease, the options, the rents, the clauses, the amendments, etc. We can see that you have to go through a certain process to abstract the lease. And because the lease is a contract that can be very lengthy, the document has to be scanned for some of those details. And then once you build out the lease information, it's easy enough to analyze the financial performance of the leases in question. So with that, we're going to open it up for questions. And my associate Kelly is going to look at your questions and read them to me, and I will go ahead and give the answer. And just to make things fun, I will bring the camera back online. And hello, everybody, I'm back. So Kelly, go ahead and tell me what the first question is.
Hi there. So the first question I have is, are there any ways to electronically abstract the lease details into Archibus?
So yes, there are. It's something we'd have to explore with you, but there are a number of tools on the marketplace that can literally, extract some of the key elements of data, populate them in a spreadsheet, and from that we can map that into Archibus. Otherwise, it's that kind of laborious process where you actually have to pay somebody the good old-fashioned way of reading the lease and typing the data into the system. Next question.
Can I connect Archibus Leases to the CAD floor plans?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't really cover that in great detail, but that's the interesting part. I kind of mentioned it at the beginning, but you can, track the areas that you're measuring in the lease. You can get down to identifying which rooms are assigned to a lease if you want to do so. But there's some things that you have to be wary of, that as you look at the lease and you look at whatever you've negotiated in the contract for a rentable area, and you physically use the CAD drawings and measure, you'll find the numbers do not equal each other. And so you have to be cognizant that you'll wonder why those numbers are different. And I've heard many stories over the years that the landlords negotiate the rent rate based on the amount of area they put into the lease. But in reality, they come up with a lot of, I don't want to call them fudge factors, but factors that allow them to incorporate common areas in ways that, get you to pay for more space. But because Archibus has that connectivity, CAD, when you're going to plan to move in, it does give you that real perspective of what space you can use. And so, yes, you can literally identify in Archibus the amount of area that you have and understand where you can house people or services that you're providing as a company or an organization. Next question.
Next question. How does Archibus store the lease documents?
Yeah, so that's just been a great feature of Archibus for all these years. So again, Archibus actually stores the documents in the database. And what you do is, depending on what the record is, it ties it to that specific record. And if you remember, there's a hierarchy. There's the leases, the table, and underneath are things like options, or there's things like rent rates, or there's amendments, or there's clauses, and those documents are attached either directly to the lease or to one of those associated tables. And then the nice thing is that Archibus will actually let you know the sum total of all documents through all the different tables that you're tied to. Next question.
Great. We have leases that expire and go into an overhold status. How would we be able to tell if the lease is expired and no longer in use or is in overhold?
That's a good question. So there's a couple ways that Archibus does that. Obviously, the thing that Archibus will do is, first of all, tell you, when the lease is about to expire so that you can plan appropriately to vacate the lease. And then there's a setting in some of the reports that basically say show or don't show expired leases. So if a lease is expired, it won't appear in your current inventory of leases. But I suppose a lot of that has to do with, are you absolutely sure you've vacated the leased area?
Very good. And one more I've got here. Is there a minimum or maximum number of leases I can track with Archibus?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's one of the, it's one of the questions that you kind of have to ask yourself. When do I want to take advantage of any sort of program? And tracking leases can be a full-time job depending on the number of facilities that you're located in. So if you're managing, I don't know, let's say 3 to 5 leases, you have to take a hard look and say, is it really worth my time and effort to put it into a database and do all the things that I need to do? Or can I just do a quick spreadsheet summary of what's needed? Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, whether you have dozens, scores, or hundreds of leases, you need a place where you can scan through and assign the leases to various individuals. So there is no upside limit to the number of leases you have, other than the number of people you have to help manage those leases and make sure that you're not overwhelming the people responsible for them.
Great. Another one just came in. In the records section, instead of downloading a document, can you put a GC doc link?
So the answer is yes. I mean, generally speaking, when we demonstrate, we store the document in the database, but the alternative is to literally put a link to wherever you have it in SharePoint or whatever other file storage mechanism you have, so that you can open the document directly.
Very good. I'm just waiting to see if any other questions pop up.
Great. Well, I think if that's it, then tell you what, let's go ahead and we'll turn off the camera again. So let's just get on to what's next. So upcoming is episode 9. We're going to drill down into the cost administration aspect of leases. So this is if you're a tenant and have rents to pay and things that you need to know about paying those rents. That session will be scheduled for Thursday, February 18th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And as always, if you have any questions, be sure to submit them to askgreg@horizonsolutions.com, and we'll be sure to include them in this upcoming presentation. Or if you think of any questions from today's presentation and you want to get an answer, by all means, send it to us and we'll go ahead and get you back a response. So with that, be sure to be good over the next few weeks, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the 18th of February. in the year 2021. Who can believe we're already in 2021? And have a good rest of the day and week, and see you soon. Okay. Thank you, everybody.